Hello, this is Gary Marr from Windows Community College. This screen captures from my CIS 166 AA students in JavaScript. What I want to do in this screen capture is talk about some of the topics covered in chapters 2, 3, and 4 in the textbook. One of the problems with the textbook, the Mirage book, is it tends to go a little fast in terms of how some of the topics are introduced. So as a result, some of the concepts they've got maybe a couple pages on are going to be expanded on as we get into class. Keeping in mind this is only week 2 of class, there's a fair amount of material in there that's not going to show up in some of our initial assignments. Our initial assignments are all a case study assignment that I created specifically for this class. So they incorporate many of the topics covered in the textbook, but at the same time this should be a little easier to understand, smaller bites if you will. So what I've got is a web page that I've created, and before I get there, let's go over to brackets and look at what I've done. 3 files, which is pretty standard issue for assignments 2 and on. Actually, as we get farther in the assignment, you'll have more files in some folders. We have an HTML file, a JavaScript file, and a CSS file. The CSS file is pretty much just a background color and a font type and color for the title. The JavaScript file is an external JavaScript file that's going to do a calculation, which we'll talk about in a second. And then finally I have an HTML file, which has got some external JavaScript that's going to be called out via this other file, and also some embedded JavaScript, which is simply going to grab today's date, display it back with an alert function, and then ask us for our name. So let's look at this. It's an HTML5 file. Let's leave the external file for a second. Let's look at the embedded script file. In your textbook, I believe it's chapter 4, talks about some built-in objects that are available to you from JavaScript. Document, windows, and date. There's also arrays and some other built-in objects also. What date does for us, it lets us pull today's date and do some date manipulation. So what I've done is I've taken this JavaScript date object, created my own version of it in memory, called it today, because that's a variable. Okay. Concluded it with a semicolon, because that's what I have to do for all Java statements. And then basically, once I have that today object, I can begin to call out different methods that belong to that class. Now, classes and methods and objects is something we're going to be getting into over the next few weeks. Don't get too bothered by the new terminology yet. We'll be covering this as we go. So within this date object, I'm going to grab the date of today. I'm also going to grab the month. Now it turns out the month is stored as an array subscript value, which starts at 0. So the month value is always going to be 1 less than it should be. So I'm going to add 1 to it right there. So I now have a variable that holds the day and a variable that holds the month. I'm going to next use a built-in function called alert, which you use a lot of initially in the first couple of chapters, which is simply going to give me a dialog box where I can concatenate some variables and strings to create a message. So it's going to basically tell me what the month and the day of today is, and I've hard-coded the year 2021. I'm next going to couple of blank line or breaks with a document write method of the document object. And what this does is simply sends at that point to the browser 2 break lines. We use write and write line a lot initially, but it's going to disappear. We're going to eventually be getting all of our data from text boxes and writing it all back to text boxes. Although later on we'll be getting it from combo boxes and other sources too. But that's as we get a little bit deeper in DOM and make more dynamic web pages. The last thing we're going to do is use another built-in function that Java has called prompt. It's going to come up and ask us for a name. There's not going to be any default value for this, just going to ask us for a name and wait for us to answer. We'll hit the OK, and then the program will continue. The display is simply 3 text boxes, a input box for total, an input box for tax rate, and I could also a total box. And I'm going to make this read-only so nobody tries to put anything inside it, because it should be the calculated value of the total times the tax rate. Below here I've labeled my button control as calc, and that's it for my HTML. So in my JavaScript, I still have the Windows onload function. This is going to be a function expression, which is simply going to be a variable that's going to store an anonymous function. Notice the function keyword's there, but there's no name next to it. That makes it anonymous, which means that it's going to execute this function then and put the results inside this particular value here, onload. So what it's going to do is it's going to put an alert out there that says program JavaScript has started. This is simply what I would call a poor man's debugger. The debugger helps you walk through your code and find errors or find what the flow of your program looks like. This just assures me that my JavaScript got loaded. The next thing it's going to do is going to set up an event which says that if on the calc ID, which is over here in my HTML, it's right here, when that is clicked, what I want to do is look for a function called calc. There it is. The other button is called amount. Oh, excuse me. The last statement here is called focus. And what this is going to do is it's going to focus on the amount ID when the application is opened. The amount ID is simply the amount box. There's the ID that's on my display when I run this program. In fact, I get the program running in the background here. There's the amount. There's the total. These two fields will accept input. This will be read-only. When the button is clicked, this times this, 1 times the rate times this will equal my grand total. You'll see that in just a second here. All right, so let's see. That's that. So when calc is clicked on, it looks for the calc function. This is a named function. This is a more traditional function format. It has a function keyword, has a name. This one accepts no parameters. This one doesn't either. The other example we had accept the ID parameter on the question function. This doesn't use that. It then next takes and has two variables, amount and rate. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull the value from the amount ID and the tax rate ID and store it into amount and rate. Again, if I go back to HTML, there's amount, there's tax rate. It's going to grab those pieces of data, stick them in variables, which I can now use and manipulate in JavaScript. It's going to check that most entries, both the entries, are in fact numeric. And actually, this probably should be an and, I believe. It's an or which will work, because one of them will be numeric, but I think it'd be better served if they're both numeric. And if they're not numeric, it's going to have a message. And if they are numeric, it's going to come down here and make a calculation. It's going to take the rate and multiply it times 100, so it's a percentage. And then it's going to take the amount and multiply it times 1 plus that new rate, which would give us the amount of the item plus the sales tax. And then it's going to sort that in total. We then next are going to do another call to document that element ID to the ID total, which again is the last box, the total box. It's read only. In that, it's going to format our total to be a fixed 2 decimals and put that in that solution box. An input box called total, actually, total. So let's go over here and let's take in, actually I've already got this running live online in the background. So if I simply refresh my browser, let me bring this down just a touch here, yes. There is my date that I asked for. Now it's going to ask for my name. There is that. That's the message that I put inside my JavaScript to know that it started. I can take that out later on. In fact, I'll show you how to do that in just a second. I click OK and it stopped. Now if I put a alpha value in there, it displays using the alert box an entry, message, an error message. And if I put a good value in there, I should take the 1 and make it 1%. The total should be $1 for taxes for that, and the grand total should be $101. So it looks like it works fine. Now, what I would do is after I fully tested it, I probably want to come over to my JavaScript and just temporarily comment out that alert message. I may want to use it again sometimes. One of the things we'll learn probably in the next class is how to use the debugger, which allows us to walk through the code, look at the values of variables as they're changing, and also follow the flow of the program. So we'll work on that probably next time. And that's it for this time. This is supposed to act as somewhat of an easier to swallow version of what was covered in chapters 2, 3, and 4, mostly 2 and 3, as it pertains to assignment 2.